Thank you for joining us as we walk through the journey of what we've seen as the major themes and the major impacts to our industry. We all know that in 2021, we saw unprecedented growth, and we saw a supply chain that dealt with congestion from ports of origin overseas all the way to the final destination, creating inventory imbalances, jam-packed warehouses, and the need to reimagine how the supply chain worked. That inventory carryover and the exponential increase in consumer demand to start the year saw our supply chains continue to be congested, with ships waiting at anchor, rails having a hard time moving products from point A to point B, and the supply chain stakeholders as a whole trying to figure out how to innovate and move goods faster and more efficiently for a growing customer base looking for resiliency and agility. Layer in the fact that we have labor negotiations impacting ports on the West Coast and the nation's rail ramp, as well as a waning in consumer spending at certain points of the year and an uncertain economic outlook. 2022 was a wild ride. Starting the year, we continued to see ships waiting at anchor, goods that were destined for holiday purchases still waiting in the ocean. Here is Noel Hasagaba, Deputy Director of the Port of Long Beach, talking about the record-setting number of ships at anchor and the impacts that had on the supply chains coming through the ports of LA and Long Beach.
So in January of this year, we were 109 ships above normal. And so thanks to the quick work of the Marine Exchange and PMSA and PMA, we were able to amend the queuing system and get the majority of those ships dispersed across the Pacific Ocean. And more recently, thanks to the softening in the market, we have 0 ships at anchor.
In response to the congestion highlighted by Dr. Hasagaba, what we saw was both industry partners, such as the Pacific Maritime Shipping Association, as well as the Marine Exchange, looking at different ways to stage vessels so they wouldn't become environmentally impactful off the coast of Southern California. But in a continuance from 2021, we saw the federal and state governments take a specific interest in the supply chain as it had the potential impact to cripple the American companies and supply chains that they relied on. In 2022, the supply chain congestion issues reached the White House as far as attention. President Biden signed an executive order on February 24th of this year, highlighting the resiliency of the supply chain and talking about how the federal government can invoke policies and invest in infrastructure that will help create more fluidity and efficiency in the supply chain. Understanding there's a lot of concerns around supply chain related delays causing increased inflation because of the cost of moving those goods, the White House, Congress, and many of our states' governors took a real hard look at what we are doing and how we can do it better from a government policy and investment perspective to keep the supply chains moving, again, to get goods where they need to be, when they need to be there.
It's great that we're making the investment in the physical infrastructure, the hard infrastructure that we sorely need, because we haven't done the investment that we needed. And, fixing roads and bridges is all a, key part of this. But we can't lose sight of, if we're going to really truly have a 21st century supply chain, we've got to focus on the IT side of this too and create better information sharing opportunities so we can identify when a problem is going to occur and how do we act at that point in time to correct or, course correct to address those issues.
Underscoring the points made by John Gold, the Port of Long Beach has made major investments with the help of the federal and state governments in digital and physical infrastructure. This would include their information highway, terminal enhancements, as well as rail enhancements, allowing the gateway to be more fluid, both for the ports of LA and Long Beach.
What we've been doing and what we will continue to do is play the long game, right? Even during COVID, we continue to press forward with our capital expansion programs. Why? Because we knew that this disruption, as severe as it was, at some point was going to end. And we kept the foot on the gas. We continue to deliver. We delivered LBCT, third phase. We delivered a new bridge. We're moving forward with our Pier Beyond Dock Rail Support Facility. It's things like that, Weston, that will continue to differentiate ports like ours, because our customers will always know that this is where the capacity is. This is where the efficiencies are. This is where we have partners like Cargomatic and others who see what we're doing, and they will pair their operations and their investments in innovation to match what we're doing and offer customers that value proposition.
Despite all the forward planning and the investments into our digital and physical infrastructure, one of the ongoing issues to start the year was the continued zero COVID policies in China. And until that's resolved, it didn't matter what we did on this side of the pond. We needed for the entire global supply chain to work as one.
Until zero COVID is no more, we are all exposed to China.
Mm-hmm.
People forget, there are still hiccups within the supply chain there because they are still shutting things down. You just don't hear about it.
Lorianne also talks with us about the impact of the labor negotiations between the Pacific Maritime Association and the International Longshore Warehouse Union, the ILWU. The last time we had a protracted contract negotiation, we saw delays on West Coast ports due to the discrepancies of opinion between the employers and the union. In May, negotiations to renew that contract, which would expire in July, started.
It's been really fascinating to see. I mean, I started talking about back in the fall of, 2021 about logistics managers looking to move their product as early as October of last year in anticipation of what was going on with July. And, with the ILWU, with the possibility of a strike. And it's just grown. And you've seen these historic amounts of TEUs moving over to the East Coast.
Some industry experts, such as Sam Galton, Managing Director of Commercial Operations from the Port of Long Beach, would cite potential economic factors such as inflation and consumer spending as a potential reason for a shift in volumes or a softening in the West Coast market.
I do have to point out that we are seeing a shift in the market. With all of the exterior market forces, we all know what's going on with inflation. We know what's going on with consumer demand. And so because of that, we're seeing less volume come to us.
While other industry experts would disagree, and they would say that consumer spending has stayed strong, it may have been augmented, but volumes for this nation are still high. They just were moved based on other factors, such as a potential for labor disruption.
What do ports need to do to kind of win that cargo back? I don't think things are going to change until we have a contract on the West Coast, to be honest. I think a lot of people are still concerned about the fact that we don't have a contract, the fact that there have been some episodes that have been reported in the press, whether in Seattle, Tacoma, in Oakland, at APM. So there's the ongoing incidences that are happening. And until we get a contract in place, folks aren't going to want to make a quick shift back. But I think, again, being forward thinking and trying to address the ongoing challenges that we've been facing, again, for the past 20 years, is going to be important, and trying to make it clear to folks that if we do have an episode, we're going to be able to respond quickly. And here's how we're able to do that. Here's how we're able to address the ongoing challenges and get the right people at the table and have plans in place to be able to move quickly.
In June, the federal government passed the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, the largest piece of legislation impacting our industry in over 30 years. This was because of many of the complaints that shippers, as well as members of the industry, such as truckers, equipment providers, terminals, and ocean carriers, talked about as it relates to congestion and the fees and penalties associated with moving or not moving your cargo on time. Not only is regulation looking to set the stage for a better and more efficient supply chain, but at the same time, it was solving issues that were created due to the massive congestion. July 1st, the ILWU PMA contract officially expired, and we started to see the true surge of volume on America's East Coast ports and Gulf Coast ports, with cargo being diverted from the West Coast ports as a result. Lorianne LaRocco talks a little bit about how the East Coast has positioned themselves to keep that cargo and set themselves up for success far into the future.
New York ousted Los Angeles pretty hard. And, they took the top spot, and Long Beach, took it second, and then LA was third. And I recently spoke with Beth Ann Rooney about this, and we talked about a bunch of different things. And for those who don't know, Beth Ann Rooney is the director for the Port of New York and New Jersey. And I thought I'd asked her, saying, hey, listen, when it comes to this congestion that we're seeing, the amount of TEUs, I know trade is sticky, and the East Coast did get a lot of the trade, back in the 2014 ILWU strike. And she was very confident. And she said the last time, and get this, Weston, they retained 65 to 70% of that trade from the last strike. So if you look at the enormity of those containers that they are taking back now, it could be a game changer.
However, other experts talk about freight will definitely come back to the US West Coast because it just makes too much sense, both operationally and financially. But it will only happen once we have a contract done between the PMA and the Longshore Labor Union, the ILWU.
Every time there's diversion, it's always temporary. In fact, I've come up with a new word: the diversion of the cargo that typically comes to Southern California. I will say it's transitory. It'll eventually come back. Why? Because this is where the scale is. This is where the flexibility is. Where else in the nation, in the world, do you have 12 different container terminals? The capacity that we've demonstrated we can deliver on and execute on over the last couple of years. We moved 20 million container units in 2022. It's amazing what the two ports are capable of doing. And as we continue to invest in our infrastructure, we continue to work with our partners like Cargomatic and every segment of the supply chain, the class ones, the short haul rail operator, the chassis leasing companies. As we continue to work and partner and collaborate with our port ecosystem, imagine what we could do together, right? So we're very bullish. We're very optimistic about what we're building here.
What do ports need to do to kind of win that cargo back? I don't think things are going to change until we have a contract on the West Coast, to be honest. I think a lot of people are still concerned about the fact that we don't have a contract, the fact that there have been some episodes that have been reported in the press, whether in Seattle, Tacoma, in Oakland, at APM. So there's the ongoing incidences that are happening, and until we get a contract in place, folks aren't going to want to make a quick shift back. But I think, again, being forward thinking and trying to address the ongoing challenges that we've been facing again for the past 20 years is going to be important, and trying to make it clear to folks that if we do have an episode, we're going to be able to respond quickly. And here's how we're able to do that. Here's how we're able to address the ongoing challenges and get the right people at the table and have plans in place to be able to move quickly.
And being ready for an uptick in freight is something that we all must embrace. Merely reducing volume to be able to dig out of supply chain congestion is not a solution. If we can't move over 20 million TEUs in the ports of LA Long Beach, which is the major gateway servicing at sometimes more than 40% of the goods coming in and out of this country, or for that matter, the East Coast ports, who have seen congestion as it related to the increased volume saw in the second half of 2022, we really haven't fixed our supply chain problems. The investments made on the fly to try to solve problems in 2021 can't be the way that we solve the problems in the future. Having companies like Cargomatic work directly with the ports throughout the country and the multiple stakeholders to provide resilient, agile, and efficient supply chain solutions is what we do for our customers. In 2022, we've seen more and more of an emphasis on the type of solutions that we as a company provide to get goods to people as fast, as efficient, and as cost-effective as possible. This is because we have to think about things differently, we have to innovate, and we have to think about things in the mind of the consumer all at the same time.
One thing I'm going to that I would say we're going to keep a close eye on is consumer spending. And notwithstanding record inflation, notwithstanding what most economists predict will be a recession over the next few months, we as consumers continue to spend at a record pace. And granted, we continue to spend with credit, but we continue to spend, and that's the lifeblood of the economy.
Times of uncertainty and, all of this congestion, it sparks innovation, and it sparks, the creativity that we need to take logistics to the next level. And so for CEOs out there, whatever, go to your employees. If they have an idea, let them listen. It doesn't matter. I would even like talk to the truck drivers. How do you make it better? It's the biggest conflict that you're seeing.
The surge in Asian imports to Gulf Coast and East Coast ports being diverted from the West Coast also has an impact on our rail infrastructure. Whether goods are coming in through America's West Coast ports, Gulf Coast ports, or East Coast ports, they still have to get throughout the nation. And the most efficient way to do that is via rail and long-haul trucking. Unrest with the rail labor unions and their employers, the major railroads, also was a cause for concern, but tightening truck capacity on America's East Coast ports because of the increased volume diverted from the West Coast ports had many shippers looking for long-term solutions to make sure that they could get their product to market at the key events it needed for back to school and the holiday season. Since the response to the COVID-related supply chain congestion, rail has been at a focal point because it does connect the entire nation. And rail capacity has been stretched to the point where at certain times since the beginning of 2021, we've actually seen the rail shut down from certain nodes. This, again, coupled with the labor negotiations that many shippers were concerned about, had folks looking to alternative methods such as transloading, long-haul trucking, and trying to get things to market before there may be a labor disruption, storing containers and storing goods in warehouses much longer than shippers usually feel comfortable. This was really where we saw the diversion of a just-in-time supply chain to a just-in-case supply chain, meaning I need it, when I need it, where I need it, and I'd rather have it available to me than not be able to get it to market at all. As part of that just-in-case strategy, we also saw the continued emergence of the American inland port, a way to get goods to different areas of the country without having to take routes through Chicago, Memphis, and other congested rail ramps.
When it comes to the inland ports, I think they're here to stay. And the reason why is the American consumer has changed. We're not going to go back pre-pandemic. We're not going to stop spending. We're just not. I mean, when you look at what people are buying right now, I mean, you may trade down a brand or two, but a lot of people are still indeed purchasing. And then also when it comes to it offers that interoperability and the flexibility that you need as a logistics person to go, okay, how can I avoid Chicago? Why the heck would you want to send a container to Chicago now? And that's actually been for the last year. You know, like, it's a problem. Well, what do? Get creative, and, if you go out of Long Beach, go to the Utah, and then, get it on a rail, get it over to Memphis.
A great example of private sector participants would be the partnership between the Norfolk Southern and Cargomatic at the Rossfield terminal in Memphis. Working together, the Norfolk Southern and Cargomatic partnered to relieve stress at their Memphis rail ramps by creating off-site yards. These were strategies that Cargomatic has used with steamship lines, trying to get goods out of the ports of LA Long Beach faster by relocating things off the docks and into near-dock terminals closer to where the customers are, reducing friction, reducing congestion, and getting things to and from the port in a much faster and more economical way. An ongoing theme, not just from 2022, but as a carryover from 2021 and 2020, was chassis shortages and dislocation throughout the country. One of the biggest issues were shippers who procured chassis as part of other contracts with steamship lines or railroads. We saw a massive push towards private chassis and controlling their own destiny. Shippers not just working with truckers who have their own assets, but also procuring their own assets through equipment providers, such as the chassis leasing companies.
There's been a shift in the market. The market share of the pull of pools has fallen, and there have been a number of new entrants, primarily private parties, whether it's shippers or even trucking companies themselves, or even the chassis leasing companies offering premium services, right?
A great example of this would be Cargomatic procuring thousands of chassis through acquisitions, new leases, and partnerships managing our customers' assets. This way, our customer had the ability to take back control of their supply chain, whether it be with our assets or their assets managed by us, and a whole new world of getting your goods to market in an efficient way. Another example of this is the Federal Maritime Commission's approval of the South Atlantic chassis pool in November. This shows everybody that you're going to need a multi-pronged approach to solve the equipment problems. You're going to need a public pool approach, you're going to need a private motor carrier approach, and especially for larger volume shippers or specialty shippers, you're going to need a homegrown approach where you're able to control the assets yourself. December started with some good news as Congress took action and President Biden signed legislation avoiding a major rail strike December 2nd of this year. 2022 was a unique year for our economy. We saw certain sectors hit a wall after record growth during the pandemic. These would include durable goods.
We've seen over the past 2.5 years now that consumer spending continues to grow, and I think consumers are eager to spend on the holidays. I think we're in line with where we were last year again, which was kind of record setting, but spending on gifts and decor and wanting to be with family and celebrate. So I think folks are very eager to do that. There's a lot of unknowns as to what happens in 2023, especially on the economy. Does inflation continue to remain high? Do we get into some kind of recession? I think many experts now saying if we do have a recession, it will be short and flat and won't be extended, so will not have that much of an impact. But still, it's folks are concerned as to what's going to happen. And again, it's not just going to be something that hits us here in the U.S., but it'll be global in nature. Many other countries are facing much higher inflation than we are, but that has an ongoing impact, and just the ongoing uncertainty of kind of what happens next.
In addition, a recent interview I did with MarketScale shows that the impacts of inflation on consumer spending were not as high as one might think. Much of the transportation-related inflation based on congestion from overseas ports and manufacturing centers to the distribution network throughout the United States has cooled off significantly this quarter, with trucking capacity becoming more available and the ability to move goods to and from warehouses and distribution centers and get them into stores and homes has become much more affordable for many of our nation's retailers. And Dr. Hasagaba agrees that 2023 will be a strong year for the supply chain, for volume, and for consumer spending as well.
Our outlook for the next year, the first half of 2023, is that the first couple of months preceding a Lunar New Year, they're going to look more like what we've seen the last couple of months here, with the market softening, with blank sailings and volumes continuing to dip, certainly on the inbound side. But after Lunar New Year, we expect an uptick, as we typically do. And what we're hearing from shippers is that there's an expectation that things will rebound, right? At some point, those elevated inventory levels that we continue to hear about in the quarterly earnings reports, those levels will dissipate. And as you and I both know, we as consumers have become very picky, and we want our products in the right season. And so there's this demand for products, whether it's fast fashion or sneakers or the latest gadget, and that's going to continue to drive the market.
Well, it's been a crazy year. It's been a wild ride. 2022 is almost behind us. And I know we've got a lot of questions coming in right now about what's happened, but really about the future. So we're going to start with the questions. There's the Q&A button at the bottom. So please don't hesitate. Ask anything you want. And we'll take the next 10 to 15 minutes to go through the questions you, the viewers, have about what's going to happen and what is happening in our crazy industry, what we call the supply chain. The first question we have is about AB5 and how does that impact the future? AB5 is here to stay in California. Obviously, companies like Cargomatic, we took a proactive approach. We were AB5 compliant before it was law. I think many companies have looked at different ways to comply with AB5. The time I spent at the Harbor Trucking Association, I know that was the main focus, is how folks could continue to operate their companies without having the threat of being non-compliant with labor law. So I think AB5 is here to stay. I think you've seen it in other areas like New Jersey. Different variations of it have been entertained at the federal level. And quite frankly, it's just about making sure if you're a shipper that you're working with compliant trucking providers and you understand what the potential impacts at a state and federal level could be if they're not. But I also think that it's important for trucking companies to understand that these are the laws, they are the regulations, and whether you agree or disagree with them, they're here and you need to comply with them, no different than any other regulation. So what are going to be the big impacts for the supply chain? I do think you'll see an uptick in many cases in cost, because where you have employees versus the independent contractor model for the hard asset owned trucking companies, there's a cost that's related to that. But also the emergence of companies like Cargomatic and the ability to broker and allow folks to continue to endeavor into the entrepreneurialism that is so amazing in our industry is a huge development. I think that shippers need to embrace the role of a broker in addition to the hard asset providers, and understand that when you work with a broker, you are actually working with the 70 to 80% of this industry that operates 10 trucks or less. And in our world, we're doing everything we can to be a leader. And we've been very successful at being a leader in layering technology in to create a one-stop shop, a single viewpoint, a single source, and allow those small businesses to grow and thrive and get access to freight that, quite frankly, a large-scale shipper doesn't want to have to manage that type of capacity. So AB5 is here to stay. I do think that you will continue to see it, the effects of it at different state and federal level regulations. But I do think we have to think about what is the best way and most efficient way to move goods. And you're always going to have small businesses be a part of our industry. The next question is, how long do you think warehouses will be at max capacity? So it's an interesting question, because if you look at real estate in many of the major markets, despite the fact that we continue to try to build more resources and have more assets under roof, in major freight markets, by and large, you see the real estate percentage of availability under 1%. Industrial real estate in places like Southern California, New York, New Jersey, under 1% of availability. And at the same time, even in growing markets, vastly growing markets like Savannah, as soon as things are built, they're either under contract or they've been under contract and they're essentially being built for the user. So it's a growing demand. The transition from just in time to just in case, making sure that goods are here and they're where you need them when you need them, has, I think, created a higher demand for industrial storage, whether that be container storage or whether that be warehouses. And I think that's the other part of it is last year, in many cases, the warehouses weren't necessarily full under roof, but the parking lots were. And now we're seeing where the goods are there because they needed to be at a market for this holiday season. But I think you're going to continue to see resources at a premium when it comes to availability in warehouse space. And again, it comes down to not just the building, but think about the surrounding resources like parking spaces and container storage. Another question here, what's the outlook on the rail labor? Well, I think in one instance, Congress and the Biden administration have asked and answered that they've put an end to the dispute. However, I also think that the labor leaders in the rail unions have said that they're going to remember who was on their side and who wasn't throughout these difficult votes. So historically, the unions have followed suit when the federal government's had to get involved in these types of discussions. And I think that you'll continue to see as much fluidity in the rail market as we've seen, historically. However, I do think that you're going to continue to see some tough talking points as it relates to the resources and really time off from a labor perspective, because my understanding is those were two of the big bones of contention was manning, crewing, and then also vacation time and having the opportunity to reset. And those aren't issues that are going away anytime soon. Looking for the next question here. Sorry, one second. There we go. Sorry, my screen, my Q&A froze for a second. Are you seeing a surge in cargo to Mexico? On many fronts, actually, Mexico has become a major player in the supply chain. So not only do we have Trump-related tariffs like 321, where folks are bringing things into American ports and then cross-bordering it to Mexico to bring it back for the duty avoidance programs. But we're also seeing more and more people that are looking at nearshoring their operations. We've had a considerable amount of our shippers reach out and say that they're looking into Mexico as a regular manufacturing site. So I think we'll continue to see cross-border play a role. I think it's going to be a growing part of our industry. And I think Mexico, you're going to see a major resurgence as it relates to manufacturing, especially of high quality goods that are going to have to come into the United States. And I think you're going to see cross-border trucking and rail become a more prevalent part of how we do imports and exports in our nation. So we have a question here about, a lot of the talk is about volume increase, and then what are we hearing as it relates for a slowdown, or I guess a softening of the market? So if you look at 2022, I think the slowdown or the softening of the market was very predictable. You had inventory that was left over from last year, and you had a large amount of it. I talked to one shipper that said they had over 7 million of one SKU that got here late last year that they were able to repurpose for this year. And there's a clothing company, a fast fashion company, that just happened to have a delay in their supply chain. And this was from the manufacturing, with the plants that they have in Asia, as well as then ships stuck at anchor, and then port congestion. So you had inventory holdover, and then the looming labor disputes or contract issues for the LW on the West Coast that started in July. Many shippers told us that they were front loading their westbound cargo before they shifted to Gulf and East Coast ports for supply chain fluidity. So in many instances, it reminds me of the end of 2018, when many of our shippers were trying to beat the tariffs that were going to take place or go into effect in the beginning of 2019. I think that many folks looked at the contract as a deadline, much the same. So I think that the 2022 slowdown that we've seen was predictable. I think the emphasis on just in case over just in time is a big reason for that. You've seen the uptick, obviously, through the second half of the year in the Gulf and East Coast port volumes. But everything that we are hearing is that consumer spending is still setting records, and interest rates are holding steady for credit cards. And the job market is still at this point in time extremely strong. This has been an interesting economic cycle. So as long as consumer spending stays strong, we're going to continue to have a need to bring things into the country. And following Lunar New Year, there are many shippers that are already starting to procure freight and procure their supply chain solutions. So I am anticipating at least maybe Q2, Q3, you'll see a very strong rebound. It really depends on how much those inventories are exhausted through the holiday shopping season and in Q1 of next year. And if we continue to see consumer spend, we'll continue to see a rebound of the freight market. But we had a lot of inventory that we had to get through. When do you predict the PMA and the ILW will agree on a contract? Well, if I could predict that, it would be like winning the lottery. I think a lot of people would want to know, but I have no idea. I've heard that from some parties that there's some really good dialogue and discussion on some key points. I've heard from other folks that are involved in and very close to the situation that have said they're still very far apart on some key points. The hope is, Gene Soroka said just last week on national television, Gene's obviously the head of the Port of Los Angeles, that he anticipates sometime in early 2023, there'll be a resolution. I think that all of the port authorities, the employers, and the union know that the faster we get a contract done, the faster we see freight rebound on the West Coast. And the longer it takes, the more likely it is that folks look at the East Coast and Gulf Coast ports as more permanent solutions. So I think folks are hopeful that it's going to happen in the first quarter of next year, prior to a Lunar New Year shipping resurgence. But I don't think anybody other than the folks that are in the room in San Francisco between the PMA and the LW and the negotiations really know what that timetable looks like. So I didn't answer the question, but that's because I don't think anybody has a really good answer for it. You see, we've got some more questions coming in. Give me 1 second. So we've got thoughts on 2023. Is it forecasted to be slow? As I said, as we speak with customers, I think many of them are very bullish on the buying cycles that are happening right now, the consumer spending, and many of our larger shippers that have the ability to procure into the future are taking advantage of what we could call a fire sale of freight rates, especially through the Trans-Pacific. And once we start to see Lunar New Year and where we get to from a standpoint of where the economy is and where consumer spending is following Lunar New Year, that's where I think we'll really get a good indication. My crystal ball is a little fuzzy as it relates to 2023 as a whole, but I actually do believe unless there's a major recession, and if we have one, it would be one of global proportion, because even if you look at inflation rates, the United States is in a much better position than many countries around the world. If we're able to have a stable economy, if there is even a flat, recession of any sort, you're gonna see shipping volumes rebound. And I think the bigger thing is going to be what's the new normal? Where do the rates sit? We're obviously not going to see $20,000 ocean rates in the Trans-Pacific, but what is the new normal? Because $1,000 ocean rates are not healthy either. So we need to get to a point where we understand what the new normal is. But I actually think I'm one of the people, and maybe it's becoming, I'm an eternal optimist, but I believe 2023, especially the second half of the year, is going to be very strong. And I think you could probably compare it to, pre-COVID numbers like 2018, before we saw a little bit of a dip in the market. Next question here is, do you think a push towards electrification of fleets in ports in California will push freight elsewhere over the coming years? I actually will tell you that long-term batteries, for instance, and electrification, batteries get cheaper, smaller, more efficient. I think the big issue in California is going to be the infrastructure, and the state of California needs to heavily invest in the grid, have energy resiliency, and we need to have a situation where everybody has an equal opportunity to actually buy electric trucks that work and that fit the needs of our customers before it becomes a real part of this industry. So it's going to really come down to how much we see in the advancements of the technology before there's a 2035. So we've got a few years, but 2035 mandate for zero emissions. We're seeing more and more companies invest in zero emissions, both from an infrastructure standpoint as well as an equipment standpoint. And we need to get to a point where it's economically viable. Sustainability is really a three-legged stool, right? Sustainability is about operational sustainability. It is about the environmental sustainability when we talk about technology, but the big part of it is economic sustainability. And you need to do well to do good, as they say. So we're going to have to get to a point where the business case for zero emissions is stronger than the business case for traditional combustion engines. And right now, it's not there. But hopefully, by the time it's really mandated in 2035, we'll get there. I mean, we have a fleet of near zero emissions trucks at Cargomatic through one of our asset providers, Atlas Marine. And, that is really the best in class control technology at this standpoint. So it'll continue to evolve. But quite frankly, if it doesn't evolve from a technology standpoint and California is unwilling to budge on their stance on zero emissions, it creates an opportunity for ports around the country to take our lunch here on the West Coast. I have another question coming in. Oh, lots of questions. Okay. The next question is about COVID and China. Says, do you think the recent explosion of COVID cases in China will bring more issues? I think that is the $1 million question when we talk about the fluidity of the global supply chain. We've really, while here in the United States and in many other countries, we've opened up, we've gotten away from COVID-related restrictions. China's been dealing with the zero COVID policy well into this year. It was just a couple of weeks ago that they started softening their COVID stances. So we've seen manufacturing facilities that are still not open that shut down in the beginning of COVID in 2020. We've continued to see restrictions throughout most of this year as it relates to the movement of trucks and different supply chain partners in China to get things from manufacturing centers to seaports to export to the United States and other consumer markets around the world. So I think it's something we all have to pay attention to. And I also think it's a reason beyond the fact that, tariffs and other financial drivers have led people to invest in other nations, especially in Southeast Asia. But COVID policies, the more we see China make it difficult to manufacture goods and then get those goods to market and in consumers' hands, the more there's a business case to move production to places like Thailand, Vietnam, other Southeast Asian countries, West Africa, and even as was brought up in an earlier question, places like Mexico and some areas of the United States. We have a question here about the rise of inland ports and thoughts of how it will help efficiency in supply chains. Again, this is a big part of the just in case versus the just in time shift. When you look at how consumers are spending, and the e-commerce has become such a prevalent part of our consumer spending habits that if I order something on a platform like Amazon and it doesn't show up within 24 hours, we're frustrated. Gone are the days of the Sears and Roebuck catalog that says you'll receive your goods in 6 to 8 weeks. So I think the role of inland ports is extremely important because environmentally, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to ship something all the way across country just to ship it back. And if you've ever followed a package on UPS or FedEx, a lot of times you will see where it's entered a port of origin, or it's entered a port here in the United States, like Los Angeles. It then ends up in Memphis via air freight or something, and then it gets shipped back to the West Coast. I think more shippers are trying to look at ways to be resilient and to get goods to the market faster. And I think inland ports play a huge role in that, from both environmentally sustainability play, as well as just an efficiency and having goods available in markets. So I think the inland port is here to stay. What's going to be interesting, though, is the inland port strategy. Is it going to be government driven, or is it going to be private sector driven? And you could argue that companies like Cargomatic have created inland ports in some of our programs with steamship lines, where we've moved things to yards where we can deliver more fluidly with immediate availability, or with rail ramps like we've done with the Norfolk Southern and Rossville. I think that you'll continue to see more innovation in the private sector in what will look like inland ports. Next question here. Do you think that the CARB rules that go into effect January 1 will have an impact? Absolutely. So I think the good news for many folks is there's been a concern about the trucking capacity in the market. If you go back to June, more than 30% of the trucks registered to go in and out of California's ports would have been ineligible starting January 1. There were some tweaks to the rule that said if you at least have a purchase order, or it shows that you're waiting on the delivery of a compliant truck, obviously understanding that the market has been very difficult for the purchase of both new and used trucks, that you can continue to operate until that's delivered. So as of 2 weeks ago, 18% of the current fleet that operates in California that goes in and out of the ports is ineligible. I guess the good news in that instance is that we're not dealing with the record-setting congestion and capacity needs. But I do think that the CARB rules that go into effect will have an impact. And for the shippers out there, you should make sure that you're working with compliant truckers. The fleets that we own are, like I said, near zero emissions and compliant. The companies that we work with through our brokerage, digital brokerage arm, we make sure that they are also set up and ready to move goods as it relates to January 1 and the CARB rules. But there are folks out there, no differently than with AB5, that have waited and then find themselves trying to figure out how to comply on the back end. So I do stress you should reach out to your truckers, because the CARB rules will have the impact of potentially less capacity, but also when you need to buy new equipment, that means you have a new capital cost that you need to equate for. And equipment costs will go into rating for many customers. You may be working with a trucker that has paid off their truck for several years and is able to operate with lower rates. And that may change no differently than we saw the first clean trucks rule in 2012. Rates went up because cost of doing business went up. So I would stress work with folks that are compliant and look to see whether or not the purchase of new equipment is going to impact your rates. Okay, we've got one here from Marcus in Norfolk, Virginia. Situation on ORF. There's a long question. I apologize. I'm just getting through it here. Okay, so this is really about volumes in Norfolk, Virginia, and how we're going to be and how things are getting routed. I think one of the things that we obviously saw was there was a lot of capacity restraints or constrictions, I should say, over the last 18 months. And because of that, we saw an explosion, not just in smaller seaports like Norfolk, Baltimore, Jacksonville, but we also saw a lot of ports that don't historically do containerized cargo get into the containerized cargo game. Ports like Everett, Washington, Port Hueneme emerged. And so where we start to see the volumes on some of these ports, and we start to see the rates that are associated with them, in many cases, you created markets. When ships show up in a port like Norfolk, we had to create markets. We had to add capacity. We had to, in many cases, repurpose drivers that were not intermodal or drayage qualified to be able to go in and out of those ports. And with that, with the trade-off for some of that efficiency to get things out of the port, not pay for things like detention and demurrage, might have been, in some cases, higher truck rates or a different lane and different infrastructure to support your supply chain. I also would say that those benefits of going through those ports will be the first ports that in many cases may see the freight leave, because historically, and I'm just speaking historically, right? The ports that have the most stability are the largest ports. It's the ports like LA Long Beach. It's the ports like New York, New Jersey. It's the ones that have the most first port of calls and the most infrastructure built around them. And so I'm not sure if I'm 100% answering the question you have there, Marcus, but what I would say is that the ports that have seen the massive growth that haven't been traditional players, you've seen a lot of investment from stakeholders to be able to make those ports work as viable options. And so it's really going to come down to the steamship lines, the trade lanes that they invest in the shippers. And do you want to continue to invest in these different ports as a regular part of your supply chain solution? And when that infrastructure becomes something that's more institutional and less of what Noel called transitory, I think you'll start to see where the rating becomes more predictable and becomes more stable, because you're not changing your infrastructure support for the needs of volume surges and then dips. And I think we have time for one more question before we call it. And this is a great question. If you're a drayage company, you offer work to owner ops who have their own authority through your brokerage firm, does that make you AB5 compliant? Again, I think everything is open to legal interpretation, but everything that we have heard, and this goes back to, again, my time at the HTA, there is a business to business exemption, right? So you are not allowed to hire an independent contractor to do something that's part of your core business. However, as a brokerage, you are not a trucking company. And most companies have complied with AB5 in one of two ways. They've either hired W-2 employees and they've converted the contractors to employees, or what most folks have done is open brokerage arms and they've worked with organizations and worked with vendors to make sure that the folks that want to remain independent can remain independent, but have the resources to be a full standing company, having insurance and permits and their own authority. And thus far, that has sufficed as being compliant with AB5. So until there's something in the court of law that says that's not compliant, or there's some sort of regulation that says you can't have a contractual relationship with another business to augment your capacity, using a brokerage model. And again, this is not legal advice because I'm not a barred attorney here in the state of California or anywhere else. So take this for what you will. You should consult an attorney, though, to make sure that your business model is good and compliant. But in most cases, we've seen that the brokerage model suffices the AB5 regulations at this point in time. So again, appreciate everybody joining us. It's been a crazy year. We're super excited for 2023. We're super excited to see what it brings. Again, I, for one, am very optimistic that following Lunar New Year, we will start to see a rise in the freight market. And while we may never go back to the 2021 volumes, I think we will have a very strong year, especially on the back half. And I want to wish everybody happy holidays. Thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you at the industry events. We hope to see you on more of these webinars and fireside chats in 2023. And quite frankly, we hope to be working together and doing business together in 2023 to make your supply chain needs come true. For Weston LaBar, for Cargomatic, from the entire Cargomatic family, happy holidays. Thank you for joining us, and a very happy new year.